Hi everyone, my name's Josh Lewison and I'm a barrister specialising in private client and insolvency. I'm back on the roof, this time to share another of my favourite cases, Lyon and Hume, an undue influence case from 1868, deeply rooted in the supernatural. The backdrop to the case is the spiritualist movement, which flourished in Britain and elsewhere during the Victorian era. At the heart of it was the belief in the spirit world and the ability to contact the dead. In England, the Ghost Club was founded in 1862 to promote the scientific study of the paranormal and counted Charles Dickens and, in later years, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle among its members. Meanwhile, in America, President Lincoln attended seances in the White House organised by the First Lady. There was an equally vigorous movement of skeptics who sought to debunk fraudulent mediums, including the English magician John Maskelyne and later the American escape artist Harry Houdini. The Lyon in Lyon and Hume was Jane Lyon, a wealthy widow. She'd inherited about £20,000 from her father and perhaps twice as much from her husband, giving her a fortune worth £7 or £8 million in today's money. That yielded her an income of £5,000 a year, worth about £600,000 today. As he was dying, Mrs. Lyon's husband had said that a change would take place in 7 years, which gave Mrs. Lyon the impression that she would not be long in joining him. Mrs. Lyon mentioned this to a photographer, who replied that it was not necessary for her to die in order to meet her husband again. If she became a spiritualist, then he would come to her. Mrs. Lyon eventually made contact, earthly contact, with Daniel Hume. Although long forgotten now, Hume was one of the most famous spiritualist mediums of the day. He was popular and well connected. At his wedding in 1858, his best man was Alexandre Dumas, the author of The Count of Monte Cristo and The Three Musketeers. His seances were attended at various times by Napoleon III of France, Queen Sophia of the Netherlands, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Elizabeth Barrett Browning and others. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's husband Robert Browning also attended, although his view was that Hume was a fraud, prompting Browning to write the poem Sludge the Medium. Mrs. Lyon attended a séance with Mr. Hume, at which Mr. Hume purported to receive messages from Mr. Lyon. There were further séances and further messages, which culminated in a message that said, "I love Daniel," meaning Mr. Hume. "He is to be our son, he is my son, therefore yours. Do you remember before I passed I said a change would take place in 7 years? That change has taken place. I am happy, happy, happy." And so within a month of meeting Mr. Hume, Mrs. Lyon was addressing him as her son and had given him £24,000. That's about £3 million today. The next month, the deceased husband, through Mr. Hume, dictated a will for Mrs. Lyon, under which her estate would pass to Mr. Hume. And over the next 2 months, Mrs. Lyon settled the remainder interest in another £30,000 worth of assets on trust for Mr. Hume. But it was not to last. 4 months later, Mrs. Lyon took some advice from a solicitor and from another medium. The second medium, who seems to have held rather more sway over Mrs. Lyon than the solicitor, was able to contact Mrs. Lyon's husband, who informed her that Mr. Hume was in fact an impostor. Mrs. Lyon applied to the court to set aside the transfers. Her case was that Mr. Hume had gained influence and ascendancy over her as a result of the supposed messages from her late husband. He had abused that influence and caused her to transfer a great deal of her wealth to him. Mr. Hume denied that he had any ascendancy or influence over Mrs. Lyon through his spiritual powers. In fact, according to him, he had tried to persuade her not to force him into a position of wealth. He also suggested that Mrs. Lyon wanted to have other relations with him than those of mother and son, and that when spurned, she had turned against him and resolved to recover her gifts and ruin his good name. In support of his case, he produced 40 witnesses. On the law, the judge reviewed the cases about relationships of influence. Guardian and ward, attorney and client, medical attendant and patient were all relationships in which gifts would not stand unless the court was satisfied that they were acts of rational consideration. Could the same be said about medium and spiritualist? It could. That placed on Mr. Hume the burden of proving that the transactions were the pure, voluntary and well understood acts of Mrs. Lyon's mind, unaffected by undue influence. Interestingly, the judge found that although Mrs. Lyon had been advised by a solicitor, the advice had been given more to protect the gifts against others than to protect Mrs. Lyon from undue influence. On the evidence, the judge was not much impressed by either side. He found that Mrs. Lyon's evidence could not be relied upon unless corroborated by written documents or unimpeached witnesses, although he did reject the allegation about the other relations. On the basis of the documents, though, the judge found that Mr. Hume had very much understated the extent to which the manifestations had purportedly taken place, and their effect on Mrs. Lyon. He went on to describe Mr. Hume's activities as mischievous nonsense. Mr. Hume could not prove the absence of undue influence, and the gifts were set aside. So Mrs. Lyon got her money back. Mr. Hume's reputation appears not to have been much damaged, and he continued his career as a medium until forced to retire by ill health. The case shows how the court can respond to novel situations and extraordinary facts by applying established principles. Instead of restricting undue influence to a handful of fixed relationships, the court was willing to look at the nature and quality of the relationship between Mrs. Lyon and Mr. Hume and interpret the law flexibly and realistically. And that, as much as the unusual story, makes Lyon and Hume one of my favourite cases. Thanks for watching.